For those of you who it might be your first time with the Education Working Group, we are one of 9 thematic and sectoral working groups that are part of the global community of practice on scaling development outcomes. So if you're not already a member, as we were just talking, we definitely invite you to join. I would say you could join through the website, scalingcommunityofpractice.com, and I think Molly was going to paste that in the chat box. But certainly we will follow up and see. It sounds like we might be having some technical difficulties and send out a new link to folks afterwards. So I just want to take a moment before we kick off this session to just acknowledge and thank our outgoing co-chair. I can't tell if she's on the call as more folks are jumping in, but I just want to thank Natika Tolani, who's really been leading this working group for the past number of years. And just want to wish her the best of luck in her new role at USAID, and I know she'll continue to be a very active member with the group. I also want to recognize my colleague at CUE, Molly Curtis Weiss, if you wouldn't mind waving, Molly, who truly just shares this co-chair seat with me. It's a big seat. And also thank Natalie Colango, who really provides so much support to all of the working groups, including ours, as well as the community of practice. And finally, I'm excited to introduce our brand new co-chair, Gael Simon, who's just joining us now, who is with the education practice at Management Systems International, MSI, and delighted to have you join us as a new co-chair. So the focus of this session is really to introduce and discuss a recently published education scalability checklist, which, as you may know, for those of you who've seen it, is meant to be a resource for practitioners and funders and policymakers to assess how easy or difficult it will be to scale a particular education initiative, to identify opportunities for and challenges to scaling a particular initiative, to plan actions to address some of those challenges and opportunities with the idea to increase the likelihood of scalability, and finally, to really serve as an ongoing monitoring tracking tool to assess progress over time. The checklist is based on an existing tool that was developed about 15 years ago by Management Systems International, MSI, and Larry Cooley in particular, who's here with us today. And it was adapted to education through a process that was led by VVOB, and a number of partners who are with us today, including MSI, STIR Education, Educate, Protham, and CUE at Brookings. So particularly delighted to have Maud Seggers, who's Senior Advisor with VVOB, joining us today as she and her team really speak this exciting effort. So very briefly, the agenda for the session is I will turn it over to Larry in a moment to briefly provide some background on the origins of this checklist. Many of you are probably aware, Larry is not only the co-founder of this community of practice, he's also President Emeritus with Management Systems International and a Senior Advisor, as well as a non-resident Senior Fellow with the Brookings Institution, among many other hats that Larry wears. We'll then turn to Maud, who will provide a brief overview and presentation on the education scalability checklist. And I'll ask during her presentation, please feel free to ask any questions or comments in the chat box. For those of you who might be new to Teams, if you just look at the upper bar, there's a little icon there to open up Show Conversation and include any questions or comments there. We'll be monitoring that chat box. Then we'll turn to discuss some of those questions and observations that you all might have before Larry walks us into small breakout groups to just briefly talk about how we might see the application or use of this tool, as well as if there's any additional support that you all see might need to be provided. And then we'll come back together for a brief group conversation before we wrap up at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. So just to let everybody know, this session is being recorded so that afterwards we can post the recording as well as the slides on the Community of Practice website. I'm sure we all are well aware of this by this point, but we would ask you to please mute yourself if you are not speaking. And then finally, while it seems like it's too large of a group to go through individual introductions, as much as we would like to have a chance to do that, I think it would still be nice for us to get a quick sense of who all is in this virtual room today. So I'm just going to ask Natalie if she might show a few questions, a poll that you might just take a moment to respond to before we formally kick off this session. So it might pop up in a few different ways, but if you want to just focus on the poll, the question that's in the middle of your screen, and just take a moment to answer the questions. If you can see it, I'm not sure if you're on your phone. I was an education working member before this event. Yes, no, maybe you're just not sure. Curious how many of us are already members. All right, interesting. It looks like we're sort of evenly divided. Oh, actually, I think we're going to grow our membership base today. That's great. We have a lot of new folks with us. That's great. All right. Thanks, Natalie. If we could go to our next question. And this one, just to get a sense of what sector you represent: government, NGO, funder, research institute, private sector, or other. Great. It's interesting to see, Larry, how this mirrors other working groups in the community of practice writ large. But really interesting to see. Okay, some nice diversity, but certainly almost half from NGOs. Great. And our final question is just to get a sense of what brought you to this conversation today, besides Natalie just being incredibly organized in her reminder emails. So are you familiar with the previous version, the MSI checklist, the more generic version? Have you been looking for a similar tool to assess likelihood, challenges with scalability? Are you in the process of adapting a similar tool, a tool from one sector to another? You're interested in the process, or did it just show up on your calendar? Okay, interesting. Sort of an even split. I put the invite showed up on my calendar as a joke, but then actually got a lot of responses. It's actually an interesting finding that we could use to our advantage. Okay, this is great. Wonderful. Well, I really appreciate that. Again, with a large group, it's just nice to get a sense of who all is with us. So with that, Larry, I am absolutely delighted to turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, and hi, everybody. I know a number of you, but there are many new faces, and it's a pleasure to meet you all. Those of you who know me know that I've been really obsessed with this issue of scalability now for almost 2 decades. And besides just maybe it goes with my personality, the other thing that I think explains it is the frustration with how few, I mean, really how few good innovations make it all the way to scale. And it's puzzling to me still 2 decades later, but in trying to figure out why some things make it through that gauntlet and so many things don't, we eventually settled on this idea of trying to identify the characteristics that help to explain the ease or the difficulty of things going to scale. And they fell pretty generally into 4 categories. Category 1 were things about the intervention itself. Was it too complicated? Was it too expensive? Was it simply a bad fit with the setting in which it was operating? Then there were some things about the context. For example, how homogeneous or not it was. And then there were things about the enabling environment, quite a lot of things about the enabling environment that often were not taken into account when people were thinking about interventions in the first place. And finally, there were things about the organizations that were involved in doing it, both the people who developed it, the people who tried to scale it. And as we dug down, we kept finding more and more nuances in these issues. Eventually, it began to resemble something in the format that you're going to hear today for the education sector, where there were some number of categories and quite a number of issues of things, each one of which in one situation or another made it more difficult or in some cases easier to take something to scale. We've now on, I think, the 14th iteration of the generics scaling checklist. I stopped counting, but I know of at least 10,000 times it's been downloaded and used. So it's gotten a lot of use across a wide variety of sectors. But this is the first time someone's put in the kind of energy that VVOB and the other players did into trying to really adapt that checklist to a particular sector. So for me, this was a fascinating process of which of the generic things simply held up and were equally applicable in the education sector, and where there were special things in the education sector that either required tweaking a characteristic or bringing in something altogether new. And you'll hear from Maud in just a little bit how that played out. But I think it's not the last time this will get adopted sectorally. And the process of trying to do that adaptation was at least as interesting to me as what we finally came out with at the end. As a person who was just involved in this latest exercise, I'm proud to have been involved in it. I think it was a super serious exercise. I really want to thank Maud and her colleagues for all the work that went into it. I want to thank the other organizations that were involved in giving their time and their thoughts to how to make this adaptation. And I hope those of you who were not directly involved will find it as useful as I'm already finding it. I'm going to hand it over now to Maud to present the tool to all of you, and we're genuinely anxious for people's input on this and any thoughts you have both about the tool itself and about putting it to best use. Maud, over to you.
Thank you, Larry, and I think that's also the cue to soon start sharing my screen. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everybody. Thanks for the introductions, Larry and Jenny, and I would also like to thank the other organizations that were involved in developing the tool. So a special shout out to Educate, Pratham, and STIR Education, besides, of course, Brookings CUE and MSI. So I'm going to use the next 20 minutes, and let me first start sharing as well. Okay, now you should be seeing my full screen. Okay, I see a nodding Larry, great. So my aim for the next 20 minutes really is to walk you through the tool and to give all of you a good sense of what the checklist looks like and how it works exactly. Of course, the proof of the ESC pudding will be in the eating, but at least this session should give you an idea of whether you are up for these desserts. Before we look at the checklist a little bit more closely, I want to make 3 general points. And that's just also reiterating some of what Jenny said at the beginning, but maybe not everybody was in the session yet at that point. So first of all, what can the ESC help you with and what not? So there are really 3 main purposes for this tool: to assess the scalability of an education initiative, to plan to make the scaling of that initiative easier, and then to track whether the scalability improves over time. With an education initiative, we really have a very broad definition in mind. It can be a teaching methodology to improve the acquisition of literacy or numeracy, a curriculum for social and emotional skills, a technology to accelerate teacher professional development, and so on. What the tool will not help you do is to assess the desirability of scaling that initiative. That's really something you should be discussing before you start using the tool, and that you should obviously be convinced of. And it won't help you to assess whether the initiative will be effective at scale. So if you're looking to use this tool, then obviously using it for the right purpose will be key. When would we advise you to use the checklist? The first big recommendation is definitely to start using it early on, from the design of an initiative onwards, so that key drivers of scaling can be taken into account. So some of the things that Larry was already mentioning, and possible obstacles can also become clear from the beginning. For example, it can make sense when you're starting to develop a new teacher professional development program. From your expected effectiveness, it can make sense that the program relies on weekly classroom observations and individual coaching sessions by trained district education officers. But if you have an early look at the distances to school that these district education officers have to overcome and the size of the district education teams, then that could quickly show that the program will be very hard to implement with the human resources in the education system. So it may not be so easy to adopt by that education system, and particularly by the government institutions therein. So the program at that point can either still be redesigned so that it will be easier to adopt, or, and that's also an alternative route you could take, you as an originating organization or as the organization that is developing that new intervention, you could ready yourself to convince the Ministry of Education to increase its district level staff numbers. But of those two options, you can expect the first one to be the easier route, obviously, so redesigning. And in other words, so planning for scale from the outset can at least prevent some common design flaws that do happen. That said, we also believe that it's never too late to start using the tool. Scaling is not a linear process. So if whenever you start using the checklist at any point, and you can take it from there. The idea is to use the checklist once a year to assess the scalability of the initiative at hand, and then to give priority actions. So to plan priority actions that should make it easier to scale. Ideally, that annual exercise can be aligned with your regular operational planning and budgeting, so that those actions really flow into your regular work, and budget can be set aside for actions that improve scaling. In the very early stages of the design of an initiative, our thought was that the originating organization may want to have the kinds of workshops that you would have to assess and to plan, to hold these internally. But as the scaling process progresses, we do see advantages in other stakeholders taking quite an active role as well, notably then government partners or those who will be involved in the delivery of the initiative at a larger scale. And those workshops that I just mentioned, so the assessment and planning workshops, they bring me a third, and then that's also the last general point I want to make. That's about the intended use of the checklist. So, and what is it not for? So from all that I've already mentioned, I think you can guess that a checklist is not meant to be a one-off scalability assessment or scorecard. And it's not the idea that based on this one-off use of the checklist, you make some kind of a final decision about whether or not to pursue a certain initiative. That's not the idea. So it's really meant to be used as quite a dynamic diagnostic and planning tool that will help you identify areas that might require further consideration and adaptation. So in that sense, it's first and foremost a planning instrument and a means to keep moving the scaling process forward. Then let's first, so when we start looking at the tool itself, first a quick tour of its basic structure. And some of you may have already opened, well, I hope so, you may already opened the education scalability checklist beforehand. It's an Excel-based tool. And so then you noticed that there are 3 recurring sheets. And these are called the individual sheet, group, and the action plan sheet. And these sheets really form the backbone of the checklist and of the annual ESC workshop. The individual and the group sheets are meant for the scalability assessment, and the action plan sheet, obviously no surprises there, is for the planning purposes. The tool already contains sheets for 2 years of diagnostic and planning, but because scaling processes are considerably longer, you will need to add additional sheets in the future. And then besides those 3 recurring sheets, there is also a sheet called Progress, and that appears quite in the beginning of the tool. And that one is linked to the group assessment sheets with formulas, and it forms an automatic tracker of changes in scalability over time. Now we're going to go into these sheets in more detail, starting with the individual sheets. No, I'm sure you won't be able to read what you can see on the screen right now, but we'll go into this in more detail, or we'll zoom into certain parts of it in a while. So the individual diagnostic is to be completed by all the participants before the workshop. And the main purpose of this is really to make sure that everybody comes to this workshop already prepared for discussion. Then it is built around, it's organized around 32 items or features of education initiatives that are classified into 7 categories, and we'll come back to those categories in a bit. But to already give you, so each feature is described by 2 statements. One that points to a higher scalability or a greater ease of scaling, and that is in this in the left-hand column. And then there is another statement about the same feature, but describing a situation where scaling will be more difficult. And then to already give you one example from the category of credibility, which I believe is category C in the tool, if I remember that correctly, then that, no, it's category B, sorry. That category contains 3 items. And one of those has to do, for example, is related to external evaluation. And then the left-hand column states that in a particular setting, an independent external evaluation has been done. And then the idea is that this will contribute to the credibility of the initiative and hence also to its scalability. And the key question there on that particular item is whether there is third-party evidence of the initiative working as opposed to evidence that may have been generated by the implementers themselves. So obviously, to complete the sheet, it's best that you first familiarize yourself with those 32 items. And then the next step to take would be to complete that column all the way on the right-hand side. It's a comments column where you would describe the current situation for each item. And only then would you really turn to scoring the items. And you would compare your own description of the situation to the statements that are provided in the tool. And so if your current situations comes most closely to the statement on the left-hand side, then a score of A would be appropriate. If it's more on the right-hand side, a C, or it could also end up being somewhere in the middle. You can already hear from the first example, I think, that this scoring is not necessarily going to be an exact science. So sometimes it's very clear, yes or no, but that won't always be the case. So ultimately, what is really important is this the description column, and to have a good understanding of the situation that is the case. Then we won't have time to go through the 7 categories during this session, but here is just to give you a general idea of what they are about, and that's also referring back to what Larry was mentioning earlier already. So the first category A is about how convincing the scaling strategy is. Category B is about the credibility of the initiative, so it's on the evidence side. C is on how strong the support for the initiative is and the challenge that it entails. D addresses the question of whether the initiative has relative advantage over the current state of affairs and other solutions that there may be. E is on the ease of transferring the initiative and having it adopted by the education system, and in particular by adopting government institutions. F is on the fit between the initiative and the education system. And G is on sustainable sources, whether there is a sustainable source of funding. I'm going to also show you, and I hope this is easier to read, that this is the largest I could get it to fit it all on the slide. But I'm going to give you some time to look at these items, because maybe there are questions about those later on. But for example, on this first slide, you can see the credibility category that we just talked about, and then this item 4 that has to do with the external evaluation, and another item on the sense of urgency regarding the problem that you're addressing, and that would be an item falling under the support category. I'm going to just give you a little bit of time to read, but I know it's fast. Let me move to the next slide. This one shows categories D, so on the relative advantage, and E on the ease of transfer and adoption. And this category E we will go into in a little bit more depth later on. I hope this has given some time to at least get a glance at the individual items there. And then category F and G, so the two last categories. So that's just a quick glance. We can always come back to some of those if there's a particular interest during the Q&A. So before we go to come back to at least one of those categories in more depth, first let's continue the tour of the sheets. So then we come after the individual sheet, there is the group sheet. That one looks as follows. And it should be completed by the participants during the workshops, and it consists of the same 32 item diagnostic. Same idea behind it, really. First, the idea is to start with the description column, and here really to arrive at a shared understanding of what the current situation is vis-a-vis the 32 items. We would advise, even if the workshop is internally, that staff from different perspectives really participate in the exercise. And as soon as possible, if you can involve multiple stakeholders, also in your partners, for example, that's definitely considered an added value. So after that, after getting a nice, clear description, same idea is but now the idea is to attribute a group score for each of the items. So it's again an A, B, and C score. It might be tricky to arrive at a consensus because especially if many people and different perspectives are at the table, so you may just end up voting for it, because after all, the score is ultimately less important than the discussion and setting priorities for action. When you have this score, so when you attribute the A, B, or C score, then that tool will automatically translate that in a numeric score. And it will also automatically calculate, as you can see in this third column here, it will automatically calculate a group score at the level of the model category. So there will be 7 group model category scores, and those are mostly important because they feed into the tracker. So it's not so much to pay because we want to focus your attention on these numbers more because it allows us to generate a chart to track progress. So the numbers, as said, are calculated automatically, and then they feed into this progress sheet. So that sheet then looks like this, and it fills itself out automatically. And we thought that a nice use of it would be really to foster pause and reflect moments and really see how are we evolving over time. The actions that we have planned in the past, are they really leading to easier scaling? Or are we experiencing setbacks? And that can also happen, of course. And to feed this radar chart into your action planning exercise. What we thought the advantage was of this radar is at least it's a quick and dirty impression of the progress that you're making, and that can be motivating, we thought, especially because scaling processes can run over long periods of time, and at least this builds your institutional memory of the process. And we thought that it could also feed then the discussion on the priorities for action. And then I'll come to the action plan sheet. It's also a very simple sheet. And it's also used during the workshop. And based on the group assessment and on the pause and reflect moment on the progress sheet, the idea is really to set a few priorities for action for the year to come. So really coming from the group reflection on what will really drive forward the scaling process and which obstacles need attention. Some of those actions may also take more than 1 year to finalize, of course. So early on in the process, you may find that you were that originating organization that had not done any external evaluations yet. And so one of your priority actions at a particular point in time may become to get that external evaluation. Then let's, I hope we still have time to look at one of the model categories and a few of the items there in greater depth. And the one I opted to put first was the one on the ease of adoption, so category E. And that one has 8 items. All of them are related to transferring a particular initiative into into the existing education system, and particularly having it adopted by government institutions. So it was a deliberate choice of the organizations who developed the education scalability checklist to put government systems front and center in several of the categories. Even when they are often struggling, public education systems do remain unrivaled in terms of their delivery network, the operational capacity, and also the incentive structures that they have in place and that are needed to deliver education to large populations. And also, that doesn't mean that the government needs to become the only provider. That's not the assumption that was made, that the government is the only or even the main provider of education. But even then, it will continue to play a key role in setting and regulating norms and deciding on national assessments and curricula, etc., that have a very large impact overall. Most of the items in this category, you've probably been able to check them by now, to have a read by now. Most of them should look quite straightforward, and that's the expectation we have about the tool in general, that most of these categories and items should not come as surprises because they really are informed by practice. But some might be perhaps a little bit more mysterious, so I'm going to pick those out, and that's 20 on the initiative being highly structured, 22 on the uptake and quality of implementation, that it should be easy to monitor, and then number 23, whether or not the initiative whether it's possible to test it on a limited scale. And I've always taken the statements from the side of ease of scaling for this particular slide. So item 20 on the highly structured initiative, that really refers to an initiative where the roles, the processes, the practices, the deliverables are clearly described and documented. Core components are clear and they can be easily distinguished from what is extra or nice to have. There are concrete tools for implementation available. For example, sample lesson plans, teaching guides, means of assessments are clear and available for the frontline implementers that teachers are. And an example of that would be, of a highly structured initiative, would be, for example, teaching at the right level, which I think most of you know originated with Pratham in India, and it's being successfully transferred to settings quite diverse across Africa, Botswana, Ivory Coast, Nigeria, Uganda, Zambia, to name just those. And in all those countries, what makes TARL unique is that the key ingredients are the same, and they are centered on a strong instructional core for teaching literacy and numeracy. And the starting point for instruction across the board is to find out what learners already know, to group them according to their level rather than to age or grade. For assessment and teachers have really an elaborate menu of fully developed materials and activities to choose from and to contextualize. And there are clear principles and guidelines for creating additional materials to maintain fidelity of implementation, even in very diverse contexts. For example, the reading assessment tool, it consists of a certain set of a set of letters, a set of words, a paragraph, a short story. And TARL that's what we consider then a highly structured initiative. And the fact that it is so well defined also gives it an advantage on item 22, for example, which has to do with the uptake and the quality of implementation that are easy to monitor. So for example, in the case of TARL, it's relatively easy to monitor because TARL monitors and mentors really would have to pay attention to only a limited set of very key characteristics that are important to implement the intervention as it was intended. Whereas, as opposed to having extremely long, sometimes as we see, classroom observation tools and a lot of elements to pay attention to in order to know whether something is being implemented as intended or not. Then, and lastly, about item 23, whether or not it's possible to test this initiative on a small scale. There too, TARL is quite a good example. For example, in Botswana and Uganda, TARL implementers, Young Love, and in Uganda it would be VVOB. We opted for a staged approach to teacher training, for example. In Uganda, we're starting with 50 schools this year and plan to increase that number to 180. So the scale of that in the beginning is not super, it's quite manageable, I would say. And the advantage of that is that it really enables learning by doing. And these early results that you can yield that way also help you to bolster support for the initiative at all levels of the system, really. School leaders, teachers, caregivers, and of course also policy makers. So there are benefits from being able to test something on a limited scale in other categories of the tool as well. And a lot of these items really have mutual beneficial effects, I would say. By contrast, so for example, policy-based initiatives are not so easily tested on a small scale. So a reform of the national curriculum would be a classic example of that. And it is indeed a process that often gets bogged down by all kinds of implementation issues, with the reform not actually landing in classrooms and not having its intended effect on learning. In the interest of time, and I hear also in the interest of my voice, I'm going to not go into the model into the other model categories, but we can definitely come back to them later if there are particular areas where more clarification could be interesting. I'm just going to conclude. So I've included them in case you want to look back at them later. Just to conclude on the main benefits that we hope to get out of using the education scalability checklist. And then I'll speak perhaps in the first place for VVOB. For us, definitely preventing design errors as much as possible. So our intent is really to start using it early on, and we are in the process of defining new 5-year programs. And one of the things that we have committed to is to applying the checklist to all of those before really moving ahead with them. To develop also first internally a shared language and a greater understanding of what these scaling processes are that we are involved in, and to pay more purposeful attention to them. Many of these items and the practices that they reflect, they will sound familiar because we're doing it already, and many of us are actually paying attention to them. But the tool really allows you to have this overview and bring it together and really pay attention to it in a focused way. And that way, we also hope and to maintain animo for scaling over time and across multiple stakeholders. In our case, to hopefully put our government partners increasingly in the lead of these processes. I'm going to leave it at that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Maud. I might ask you if you don't mind to stop sharing your screen so we can see a few of us who are on video. Really appreciate a fantastic overview. I know a lot to cover in a short period of time. I hope that some of you have had a chance to already look at and engage with the tool. As you might see, it's meant to be quite user-friendly and hopefully self-explanatory, as well as some accompanying materials that VVOB has created, such as a user guide to use with it. But at the same time, we know that many of you probably already have questions and others need to engage a bit with it and think about their questions later. So why don't we take a few minutes now to see what questions or observations or comments you might have. As I mentioned, feel free to include those in the chat box, and we'll ask if you want to share some of those or try to group some of the questions together before we go into breakout groups to have further conversations. So I know, Joe, can I maybe turn to you? I know you had a really good question towards the beginning about the design of the tool for sort of scaling a program or system scaling. Would you mind, you want to ask that question?
I'll give it a go. Thanks, Jenny. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Perfectly.
Good. Okay, hi. I'm Joe Hallgarten. I'm just become a director of a very small charity that does teacher leadership work in a few countries around the world. I'm not sure if we're ready yet for this checklist, but I'm going to try it and see. But my question is more generally around whether this is about program scaling rather than system scaling. Meaning, is it about just trying to scale out of a particular program to make sure it reaches more numbers, or is it something where you can think about other kinds of scaling up and scaling deep in terms of making changes to the system rather than just increasing the numbers that benefit from your program? It's informed slightly just by some work we did with STIR Education a couple of years ago, looking at their system scaling efforts. And one particular comment from a practitioner there who said, we're not trying to scale a program, we're trying to scale an attitude. And I guess my question is, this is about scaling a program, scaling an attitude, or both?
Great question, Joe. Larry, please.
It is a great question. And in fact, this particular question is exactly in the bullseye of a conversation we're having broadly within the community of practice about scaling, not only in education, but generally. And the way I would answer it, at least from my perspective, is it's definitely includes system scaling, but only if you can articulate something as an intervention, if you can somehow explain as clearly as possible what the change is. In fact, it not only is consistent with system scaling, it assumes system scaling. Because in order for anything intervention to reach scale, it has to become part of the new system. And that means everything else in the system typically has to accommodate to that. It's normally not simply a bolt-on, it's usually some modification to something that's systemic. So for example, an attitudinal shift would absolutely be covered by this. And this, in the best cases, would help to illuminate why some of those changes are as challenging as they are, either in terms of the ability to monitor the change or the complexity or the clarity of the intervention that's necessary to try and bring it about. So I would very much encourage you to use it, and we'd be really interested to hear your feedback on it. But from the point of view of the designers, it's absolutely intended to cover those sorts of interventions.
Maud Devyani, I know, is on the call with us from Pratham and others. Please feel free to jump in. And I'll go back, Miguel, to your question in a moment, but just building on Joe's question, Raul from SUMA had a question as well. I don't know, Raul, if you wanna ask that.
Sure. Thank you very much for the presentation. I think it's really interesting, and building on Joe's question, I was because I was thinking something very similar from the different size of the interventions, and for instance, coming from the Chilean experience implementing the quality assurance system, when you already have a reform that has been approved and it has to be implemented, you have to be starting with little pilots, and then, but you can start using this kind of tools from the beginning. So I wonder if you have any kind of experience doing this, or maybe we can start thinking something together in Latin America and the Caribbean. That would be my question.
Maud, I don't know, it looks like, are you trying to unmute?
Well, I was unmuting, but as VVOB, we can't claim to use the tool in that particular way, as you mentioned, yet. But what we do definitely notice that, or have noticed when we applied, first of all, the generic scalability checklist to some of our programs, is the need very often for adjustments to regulatory frameworks that exist. So very often, actually, you end up needing to update certain, maybe not always all the way up to national education law, but certainly at lower levels of regulations. And I think what the tool has helped us for is really to identify which of the conditions that we need to create that really will support us moving forward the kind of work that we do. So the kind of work we do is on teacher professional development and school leadership development. And I think, well, for at least also it brings to light some of the complexities of actually scaling. There are a lot of things to think about, and helps, I think, also to make us more patient about some of the reforms that we want to see.
And Maud, while we have you off mute, Miguel, I know you had a separate question around the relative importance of the different categories and how one should think about that. Do you want to just quickly ask that question? And Maud, maybe you would respond. I know you address it in the tool. Well, I'm also happy, Miguel, to read it. But yes, Miguel asks, you know, has experience shown that all the categories items are equally important, or would that depend on the specific education initiative? Oh, there you are, Miguel. Hi.
Yeah, hi. No, thank you, Maud, for the presentation. And I have to say, this is the first time I see the tool. And my first impression is, well, there are many things there, and you know, it's a bit heavy. Like, this is my first reaction. So then my question, and it's more not to the developers of the tool, but more for those who have used the tool in practice. If you know, depending on what you're trying to scale up, you know, if you can simplify it by focusing on certain categories or certain items, or the recommendation or the experience is to use them all, like all of them are equally important, and is advisable to use, you know, to keep the tool as it is with all the categories and items. And this is in a way in the same direction of Clark, the other question about, you know, what is the actual use and the challenges and successes when using it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Larry, I don't know whether you want to go on that, because the tool obviously it's in its early stages. So in terms of the complexity, one of the advices that we definitely got from Larry when we were going through this process is to not make it any longer than it already is. So the original scalability checklist, I think, also has 32 items, and we really worked hard to keep it to that. But yes, it is a lot. In our own experience at VVOB, we've used the generic checklist because this tool is really only just out. We've used it with its 32 items to screen many of our programs, and in terms of time it took, that was quite feasible. The big advice, I think, would be is to not start planning actions for all these items. There it really becomes a matter of putting the right priorities, and those priorities, I think, depend in part on the characteristics of the initiative itself, and in large part also on the context that you're working on. What is urgent now? What needs to be addressed first? So the tool and the assessment part of it, I think, is really meant to give you the broader picture, the bigger picture, and help you to identify areas that are more urgent to address first, without losing track of everything else. But I think that from the discussions on it, around doing the assessment, that's really where the priorities for action come about. So that's my impression of first, early uses of this.
Miguel, maybe I can add a piece onto that. This version of the tool is, of course, new, but the predecessor, the one that MSI has been using for now almost 20 years, I've had a chance to apply hundreds of times at exactly this level of complexity. And if you overthink it, it becomes complicated and lengthy. But in fact, the way it's intended, the entirety of the tool, is basically to get a sense of how a group of stakeholders understand the situation they're involved in. And it's a matter of perhaps an hour of people in a room really thinking hard about this. Then it quickly moves in exactly the direction Maud suggested, which is there are 2 or 3 or 4 issues that really jump out as being central concerns. and the places where, from an action planning and from an operational and maybe even a decisional point of view, sometimes it's important to concentrate. And if you don't have a strategy, to wait until you do. Because in those sorts of situations, there's an old expression, you may have heard it. There are three great mysteries in the world. That's air to the bird, water to the fish, and man to himself. And the feature of that plays out for me is that we often have blind spots about the things that are most fundamental, but which we don't consider in this thing. And I think it's most useful for that, to get a group of people to agree on where the biggest challenges are going to be and what can be done to try and overcome those. So if you saw this as some sort of an extremely elaborate diagnostic where you needed strong documentation and evidence on each of the points, I think the concern is absolutely legitimate, but it's not intended to be used in that way.
Great, thanks, Larry and Maude. I might suggest at this point, I know Heather, there was a question from Claire about some examples of using the tool and some experiences, as well as some successes and challenges.
Let me just for a second ask each of the four groups to maybe bring back a couple of things that stuck out for them in the conversation. Jenny, let me start with your group, and either have you mentioned a couple of things or call on a couple of people from the group to do so. But everybody keep their comments short if you would.
Well, I might ask our colleagues at our group, one of you, I might call on you to continue. And for those of you who are in our group, Javier probably made you jealous by catching the end of the comments. We had a great conversation. We started off with Heather sharing the experience of Room to Read and using the tool. And you know, I don't know, Heather, if you want to say just a word or two, what you were saying, starting with sort of contextualizing and systematizing Room to Read approach to then thinking about the system side of reforms.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. Well, real fast, we had the pleasure and benefit of picking Larry Cooley's mind for many years, and we used a version of this tool to scale improved education interventions internally to Room to Read, pretending we were the system itself that we were trying to scale. And then over the last 5 years have used this tool to improve our work to influence system reform and scaling through system. It's been very helpful.
Thanks.
And then we switched very quickly, Larry, to talking about maybe a little bit of Joe and Raul's earlier question about, are we thinking about sort of scaling out and scaling programs versus scaling deep and system scaling? And a lot of that, as Javier was talking about, probably depends on the origins of the innovation, where it comes from. Is it sort of distinguishing between levels? Is it around policy and legislation? Is it around institutional change and reform? Is it sort of at the programmatic level? And maybe further adaptations of the tools that could be useful to think about those different levels. As well as we had a lot of representation from Latin America and thinking about would sort of contextual adaptations be necessary for different regions. And finally, Javier, I might turn to you to just talk about your great suggestion about thinking about the pathways for using the tool and ways to maybe thinking about it being more relevant and manageable.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. No, we're just discussing the possibility of so that it could be more usable as a tool. And since it's a long list of items, maybe to, just as we do in any survey in which you have a certain question and depending on your answer, that will take you through a different track of items that are much more relevant. And then also you can go deeper into the question. We could think of the same thing for this tool in the sense that if it's a, let's say, program level initiative, that would have its own kind of items related to that kind of scaling process, because it's quite different from another one, which is a legislation level, for example. And also if it's a centralized or decentralized system, because if it's a centralized, for example, a state system, that means you have to put a lot of effort in convincing the state, etc. But if it's a more decentralized and even privatized system, that doesn't require so much talk with the government, but actually really getting a critical mass of schools just adopting your, let's say, program.
Javier, if you end up doing that, report back to us, will you? That's a good suggestion. Maud, let me turn quickly to your group.
In our group, we looked a lot at what it would take to really start using it in organizations. So some of the feedback that we got, and I think some of it is similar to what others are saying here, that how do you convince people to start using it when it does look quite a lot with these 32 items and quite a lot to go through. So some of the tips that we got is really to find the good timing to start using it. So for example, when models have gone, in fact, the example that was given was about new models for teacher professional development that are being developed right now. So when they have gone through a first round of implementations, lessons can really be learned already about where is the rub for implementation and further rollout. So that could be a good timing for starting to use it. And then maybe also the need to train at least or have at least one person in a team that has a thorough grip on it and can really guide these kinds of workshops. Then some of the other things that were raised were how do we deal with these multiple voices where people may have quite different assessments of where a particular situation is at, and coming really to an agreement on what at least the facts are, even if the scoring might be not so easy.
Thanks. Molly.
Yes, our group talked a lot about the issue of complexity and the challenge of wanting to scale things to address complex problems in education, and would this tool end up prioritizing the most simple innovations? I wonder actually maybe if Raphael and or Mabel want to speak to that conversation we had. Otherwise, I'm happy to summarize their points. But
yeah, sorry, thank you, Molly. I had a question about the issue of complexity. Maybe building on what Javier said before, there are some interrelationships between the different dimensions. So complexity, for instance, couldn't be addressed isolated from others. Maybe complexity is something necessary if the problem that needs to be addressed is complex enough. So the critical levels of achievement in different dimensions could be less or more critical for scalability depending on the whole context. So that was my question, and my fear was, as Molly said, that for a government, we could bias the solutions to simple problems with simple solutions.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a fair and legitimate concern. Let me turn finally to the group that I was facilitating. Again, it was a really stimulating conversation. I would have liked to have stayed for a while. And we talked about issues like quality and how quality is so much more difficult sometimes to track than quantity. We also talked about these issues of complexity and so on, but I'll share just two things that I think are additional to the points that have been made by others. I'm going to ask Toon to talk a little bit about how perhaps the tool could be used to build consensus or to deal with the diversity of viewpoint. And then I'm going to ask Gael to talk a little bit about how it relates to evaluation and a couple of lessons she's picked up in coming in from an evaluation perspective. Toon?
Yes, thank you, Larry. Well, I remember when we started our learning trajectory, when you mentioned that sustainability and scaling are two sides of the same coin, and I think this is really what this tool is then about, because the tool, the way I see it to be used is it helps the practitioners to really think about what does it take to bring things to scale, and what are the criteria for that. So what are your levers that can help you to bring your programs to scale, and the tool then is really helpful to have a deep dive into the change you want to promote, and can be used at the very beginning of your intervention, as we, for example, now start designing our new 5-year program. It will become important to check our ideas against what this tool is then guiding us with. But also it will help with the planning, it will help with reviewing and with the evaluation. So if anything else, the tool will help raise awareness around the importance of scaling in our interventions.
Thank you
Larry?
so much. Thanks so much. Gael?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So we've used it a couple of times for evaluations of education projects, usually at midterm or inline evaluations. And what we found is that there are quite a few elements that people don't think about throughout the implementation of projects, and that they wish they had thought about previously, right, during the design phase of the project. Things like having an external evaluation, particularly focused on quality, has been very jarring for people when they don't have those results. And so they have a hard time using the tool. And I use the predecessor tool, I should say, with that. So I think using the tool in general earlier on the project, as Maud suggested, for the design phase, and then having regular yearly check-ins would be very important.
Thanks. Sorry we don't have more time for this conversation, but I'm already stimulated to think about several things that we have not thought all the way through yet, and appreciate the input in doing just that. Jenny, let me hand it back to you to close.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Larry. And thanks for all of you for all your great questions and ideas and suggestions. An hour and a half is certainly not enough time, and we hope this is just the beginning of a conversation. As you continue to use a tool, as you engage for the first time with the tool, we just ask that you just reach out and continue to be in touch. Other ideas that you might come up with, questions you have, suggestions to strengthen it. As Larry said, he thinks the previous tool went through 14 iterations, and Maud, not that I'm suggesting the same for this one, but I imagine this won't be the final version either. So whether you reach out to us directly or on the Scaling Community of Practice website, again, we'll be posting the PowerPoint presentation, recording of this conversation, and there'll be a comment section. So that's another great place to please leave your thoughts and ideas. And we'd also love to hear how you are using the tool. We already heard some great ideas from Gael and Heather and others who have engaged with the tool. Just to remind everybody that we have a few other webinars coming up this year. In June, we will be looking at some of the lessons learned from adaptations and response to COVID-19. This is a follow-up conversation from a webinar we held last April, and really a chance to look back at some of the lessons learned as we think about adaptations not only to this global pandemic, but to future disruptions in learning. Then later in the fall, in September, we'll be focusing on EdTech and its potential for scaling. And then finally, we'll end the year with a session around costs and costing data and how that can inform scaling decisions, some of the challenges and opportunities around that. These are ideas that have come directly from the working group members. And again, we welcome ongoing ideas of sessions that you all would like to have. We've asked you to please join us in either leading these webinars, facilitating, presenting, sharing resources and materials that you're developing. We've already heard from a number of you for these webinars, and invite others to join us. And finally, I just wanted to say that while we're really excited to share this education scalability checklist with you all today, we know that this is really part of what I think is an exciting trend to see some of the research and knowledge that's being generated really being packaged and codified and shared in a way that is practical and actionable guidance for those of us who are working in various ways to lead a scaling process, to take scaling forward and systems change. So all that is to say is we welcome you to please share those tools and resources that you're involved with and you're developing. Again, please leave that on the Community of Practice website, and we'll be sure to collate a list and share those as well. So thank you all very much, and a big thank you to Maud and her colleagues at VVOB and others who've been involved in developing this tool, and to you all just for your engagement. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye. Take care.